At the outset, I would like to thank India International Center for providing me an opportunity to talk about Kashmir and in more specific terms, talk about the historic city of Srinagar. Srinagar for about 500 years was known as Shehr-i-Kashmir, which is city of Kashmir. So Kashmir was Srinagar and Srinagar was Shehr. This has happened in many historic cities, especially in Middle Asia, which includes Central Asia, Iran, etc. We know that the story of civilizations has been told through the story of cities, and cities have been and still are economic drivers and a hub of religious, political, and creative expression of people who live there, and by extension, then the whole area, a state, a culture, a civilization. I would like to take you through a presentation of the city of Srinagar through history of Srinagar, but the main focus would be through the medium of architecture. So I would like to explain the city, the historicity of the city through the medium of architecture. This is a PowerPoint presentation and I hope I'll be able to follow through this. Let me start the presentation. So this, as I mentioned, is journey through Shehr-i-Kashmir that also meant the city of Srinagar. Well, if you look at this map, you'll see that Srinagar is the northernmost city of the subcontinent. But if you look at the same map from the other side, from the top, and you look at the world around the subcontinent, which is Afghanistan, Russia, Iran, Central Asia, the Chinese part of Central Asia, then Srinagar would be the first city of arrival into subcontinent. And we have a lot of archaeological evidence showing that that happened to be an archaeological fact, that happened to be a fact of ancient times. When people transited from Central Asia, they used Srinagar, or they also used Srinagar as a transit towards the larger Gangetic plain. And that is something which has been documented by archaeological exploration, places like Hammam, which is a different story, and maybe we do that sometime. This is a map of Srinagar city that I am showing you. The brown part is the first settlement which came up in 250 BC. That further expanded into areas which is orange, then further expanded here. And the city, as of now, is this whole. So it is a story of about 500 years of living traditions, as I said, through the medium of architecture. That will be explained. Yeah. About 100 years back, in fact, now more than 100 years back, this Srinagar is a riverine city. It has grown and evolved on the banks of a river, River Jhelum, which is the main river which drains out waters from Kashmir. The whole city has come up on two banks of the River Jhelum for a period of, as I said, about 2,000 years. This photograph of the riverside of the city is about 110 years old. And you can see this imposing mosque, a defining landmark which is Hari Parbat and his houses. If we move ahead, this photograph is contemporary. You can say 5 years to 4 years old photograph. You see, not much has changed in the city, in the riverfront of the city. That speaks of the historicity of the architecture of Srinagar city. Now, this city has been, as I said, this has happened in most of the cities of the country. In fact, all historic cities. I will take you through the historic definition of how this tea was looked at over a period of centuries. We have our own Kalhan Pandit, was who was a poet, but his kavya also became the history of Kashmir in 12th century. Incidentally, one distinction which Kashmir has, or which Kashmir has had, was that it is the first state or first area where we have a continuously recorded history of about 2,500 years. And Kalana, but many historians, contemporary historians, have been saying that is the first Indian historian. Though, as I said, he thought of himself as a poet, and through his poetry, through his kavya, he wrote history of Kashmir of preceding 2,500 years. When he mentions Srinagar, mind you, this is 12th century, he says the mansions of the city, which reached the clouds and were mostly built of wood. So there are two things which we have to take from this quotation of Kalhana's Rajatarangini. Rajatarangini incidentally means the story or the flow of the kings. That the main building material of the city houses or city structures was wood too. They were quite high. And they were as high because Kalan, being a poet, mentioned they reach up to clouds. Subsequently, if we move ahead another 300, 350 years, we have for the first time a first formally known historian, a Mughal historian of 15th century, who is known as Mirza Haider Dugla. He has written, in fact, the first Mughal history, which is well documented, the earliest Mughal history is from Duglat, one of the earliest, where he talks about, he came to Kashmir and also became a ruler of Kashmir for some time. He says that, talking about Srinagar, this town has many lofty buildings constructed of fresh cut pine. Most of these are at least 5 stories high. Now, this is a historian talking, compared with Kalhana, who says they go up to clouds. So we should infer that about 5 stories tall buildings. And this view, they bite the fingers of the astonishment with the teeth of admiration. So that's what Douglas thought. The building material perhaps remaining the same. Now, fast forward when during the colonial periods, the Britishers kept on coming and writing about places they visited, and G.T. Vine was a traveler. When he looked at Kashmir, and this was not a very good period of the history of Kashmir. He came here during Sikh rule, which is one of the cruelest rules Kashmir has ever seen. In fact, in terms of natural disasters and the man-made rule, Kashmir was not a very pleasant place to live. However, when he looked at Kashmir, obviously he would have looked at architecture, he would have looked at the crafts. He makes mention of Kashmir, which is again Srinagar, in these words. Kashmir will become the focus of Asiatic civilization, a miniature England in the heart of Asia. So that's how he could look at Kashmir, obviously looking at things which he saw in Srinagar. This city was founded during Ashoka's reign in 250 BC. Well, Ashoka's reign was the time when Buddhism got a flip in the subcontinent, and one of the most admired and most well-known documented things which Ashoka did was that he sent monks, Aryahants all over the country to propagate Buddhism, and in the process they also set up small habitations. And Srinagar is supposed to have been one of these habitations. Mind you, this is 250 BC. But subsequently, as I showed you in the earlier slide, cities shifted from one location to another location. But for quite some time, for about 700 years, the city was a center of Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist arts and crafts. During the first century, then onwards, we were part of the Gandhara Empire. And you know, Gandhara is one of the empires that has given the best of the creative arts to the subcontinent. After Gandhara period, when Buddhism waned out and we again had, or again the Hindu rule was established, this location again changed. It went towards a hillock. Those of you who are acquainted with the geography of Srinagar would know that there's a hill called Hari Parbat, which is about 14 kilometers west of where this tea used to be earlier. And Hari Parbat was close to river like the earliest tea was close to the river. So tea developed on the right bank of Jhelum because Hari Parbat also falls on the right bank of Jhelum. As I mentioned, the geographic location of the tea is closer to Central Asia, closer to Middle Asia and China and other parts of other parts of Asia, and these were flourishing civilizations. What happened was that because Srinagar was on the transit route or on the route towards Gangetic Plains, this became a major hub of activity, both of trade, commerce, and ideas. In 14th century, when Islam was introduced in Kashmir, that was the time when we had flourishing Muslim empires around in Central Asia, in towards Iran, and that was the time when we had a huge influx of missionaries, obviously for propagating faith, then religious scholars, poets, writers, and craftsmen, mostly from Persia and also, as I mentioned, from Central Asia. What happened because of this influx? Because of this influx, because we had now become a place which was located on the crossroads of cultural influences. It evolved as a trade and craft based city, and its prosperity obviously depended on the commerce. Workshops, bazaars, in fact, book making was one of the book manufacturing, book writing, calligraphies, and bookshops were one of the prominent activities which were undertaken in Srinagar, and they supported the urban lifestyle. Let me tell you that it's not that it was because of advent of Islam that we came on the crossroads. We were already on the crossroads, but then cultural influences of a greater intensity took place around this period. Oh, that is what the history is about. Let's now come to the present, and we have to go through a presentation which talks about Srinagar of today. What happened after this? Since 50, which is post independence or immediately post independence, we became part of a, I won't say degradation, part of a change which took place in other subcontinental states. The states entered into a very new phase of urbanization. What happened because of this urbanization was that it challenged the settlement pattern of the states. And obviously, the first casualty was community institutions, which had come up around these markets and religious places, public spaces. So that is where the first impact came in. And with these impacts, a new urban and social challenge when this new urban and social challenge was unanswered. That resulted in loss of cohesion. I would also like to say that the failure to reconstruct the traditional networks of personal and communal links in the new settlements or in the newly urbanized areas, it impacted the character and identity of city, in fact, to a larger extent. And as I said, sorry, yeah, but in spite of all that I have said in the introduction, this is still a unique example, which you will see in the following part of the presentation, of the built heritage and vernacular architecture. And it has, as I mentioned again, been identified as a major living heritage city of the subcontinent. In 1988, Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, the short form being INTAC, where I also work, it prepared a proposal for conservation and restoration of the city. And at that point in time, for the first time, a process of documentation of the cultural strengths, heritage, and architecture was initiated. What Intact did was they came up with a project which was known as Cultural Resource Mapping of Srinagar City. And under this cultural resource mapping, which this happened in 2004 when I was around, 130 square kilometers were defined as the older part or the historic part of the city. And in that historic part, about 838 structures were documented. This has also been, this documentation is spread over 5 volumes, and the documentation includes geographic and political history of Kashmir, talks about evolution of Srinagar city and its settlement pattern, categorization of the various architectural styles, detailed heritage maps, detailed digitized heritage maps. So this is the map of Srinagar city. Again, you can see the river Jhelum, which is in the blue here, and red area is the cultural, the heritage zone. The yellowish area is the expansion. And you can see this city has evolved around the river, which I mentioned earlier also in the presentation, opening remarks. I talked about mapping, and this is how the mapping was done. So digitized maps were prepared first time for the city, where all the historic structures, precincts, sites were located. These maps are to the scale. The streets, lanes were mapped, and on the right column, if you see, these are the numbers and names of the buildings, and each structure or each style or each function has an icon, be it religious, commercial, public, educational. So you can see River Jhelum in the blue, as I said, is the defined Srinagar city. Again, the waterways moving out of Jhelum, which again give a unique character to Srinagar. And at many times, people have talked about Srinagar as Venice of East. That's because of these canals coming out of the river or joining the river at different parts. On this is a digitized map of lake, because Srinagar, when you talk of Srinagar, you can't get away from the physical dominating presence of a huge water body, a historic water body, which is Dal Lake. Now let's go to the architecture. This is one of the first monuments which was built in Srinagar. This is an early 15th century monument built as a commemoration for the mother of the first popular king of Kashmir, who is known as Badshah. He ruled for 50 years. And obviously, if one gets 50 years, he does wonders. So this typical structure is made of brick. Now, you have heard the references which I mentioned from Kalhana to Mirza Haider Doglat, who's at Srinagar. Houses are going up to cloud or 5 stories. There's no wood or timber in this structure. It's a typical Central Asian structure. Some people say this is made on the pattern of Gauri Amir in Samarkand, and there's a lot of Samarkandi influence. This was the first monument. Mind you, Zainul Abidin was a very secular minded person and a person evolved out of a composite culture of Kashmir. But he also at that point in time thought that a commemoration would mean brick or perhaps stone as well. But let me tell you, this is the only structure of its kind that was constructed in Srinagar. Nothing followed. People did this style, these materials didn't find favor with the builders in Kashmir. This is another stone structure that was built by Mughal. In fact, this is a mosque built by Noor Jahan. This is variously known as Shehr-i Masjid, Pathar Masjid. I'm showing these structures is because earlier on I mentioned Srinagar was defined by timber. But these are the interludes where other materials and other styles also came up. But let me again repeat that these were one of their kind. No, nothing followed Badshah's mother's tomb. Nobody did structures in brick. If there's a mosque, about 2 mosques were built by Mughals here, both are wood, but after that, no stone structure came up for a mosque. Now, this is a structure for a city which was built by Mughals, and they called it Nagar. It was built by Akbar immediately after conquest of Kashmir in 16th century. This is the gate for this structure, and this gate is known as Kathi Darwaza. This gate also commemorates the arrival of Mughals in Kashmir. Inside this, there's a fort. This basically gate is part of a rampant uh, part of a wall which was constructed by Akbar for the city, a city enclosure. And at that point in time, more than a crore of rupees was spent. That's another history. But these are stone structures which are in Kashmir. This was also a period when Islam came to Kashmir. Obviously, there was a need for cenotaphs. But I would like to mention here that these cenotaphs you would have seen in other parts of subcontinent as well. They have Arabic and Persian calligraphies. They are beautifully carved stones. But one distinction which I would like to point out, I don't know if I will be able to show that here, perhaps not. 100 years after the advent of Islam, our cenotaphs also had writings in Sharda and in Sanskrit, saying the same thing what is said in Persian, the name of the person who is interned there. He was a Shaheed Sultan, he was a poet or a ruler or a noble. But that would also be on one side there would be Persian and the other side there would be Sharda or Sanskrit. In certain either Sanskrit and Sharda only. So that is one thing which needs to be noted, that even while the faith changed, while the ways and ways of worship changed, the continuity of a language was also taken to writing on the cenotaphs. Now let's go back to what I mentioned about timber architecture of Kashmir. This is the first prominent shrine which was built in Kashmir. This shrine has been built for commemorating the arrival of Mir Sayyid Ali Hamadani, a very renowned scholar, a mystic, a personality who was very well known in the Muslim world of this part of the globe. When he came here on a visit, which happened in very late in 14th century, sometime in 1388, and on his visit, subsequently, that place attained sacredhood, and the place became very popular. Therefore, there was a need for a shrine in his name. This shrine is known as Khanaka Molla, which means Khanaka, as you understand, would be a Muslim shrine, and Molla means the biggest Muslim shrine. Now, following that structure, now we have structures which have been constructed in Kashmir. And these structures are all timber structures. If you go back to Shah Hamdan Shrine, this is all timber structure. So after an interlude of some years, we revert back to wooden structures. Again, a wooden structure, Muslim shrine, a wooden structure. You can see the use of wood in the structures. This is all wooden structure. I will briefly also define this structure in subsequent slides. And you can see this is a wooden structure, totally wooden. Now we come to a structure which was an elaborate construction in the city during the Muslim period and perhaps one of the first. This is known as Jamia Masjid. You know, in all Muslims, in fact, all cities where Muslims went, the first and the major construction would be a mosque, a Jamia mosque, an elaborate mosque, a big mosque, and it would be named as Jamia Masjid. Therefore, Srinagar also has a Jamia Masjid. Now, this is what the Jamia Masjid is about. It is a brick structure, and it has openings, it has a facade, you can get in. It has also an Iwan inside. It's a structure which is constructed in a manner that you have a lot of open space, known as Iwan, and a water body which is used for ablutions, etc. Now let's look at this structure. You would have seen, you have a memory of a Jamia Masjid Delhi, Jamia Masjid Lahore, Jamia Masjid all over. Those are all dome structures, which is also known as Indo-Islamic dome or an Islamic dome structure. And this structure, the Jama Masjid of Srinagar or Jama Masjid of Kashmir, does not have a dome that you would mark from the structure. Instead, it has a body here that resembles a stupa. And over the stupa, you have a brang, called locally brang. It resembles a shikha. So how this has been interpreted here is that this architecture is something through which we negotiated or mediated through different faiths. And while they were building an Islamic structure, they also reconstructed their past identity of stupas, of shikhars, and you can see this subtle resonance in the Muslim architecture of the whole valley. This is another place of worship, is a temple located on River Jhelum, and see how well it gels with the architecture around the riverfront. The structure is made of, there is a dome, of course, there, but this body is wooden. Again, what Kalhana said, the pine wood. And this architecture essentially derives out of the vernacular stuff architecture. Well, this is another example of the evolution of the city. You'll see the ground floor, we have shops, and these shops have been established in the main marketplace of Srinagar known as Maharaj Ganj, built during the Dora period. You can see the first floor and the second floor, they are residences. So this is a mixed use structure where you have shops on the ground floor, and these shops do not encroach on the residential space because they have been given a recess. It has a very well thought out facade that doesn't disturb the look of the place, that retains the character of a residential area and at the same time a place where commerce takes place. Srinagar, for a very long time, we didn't have a road to Srinagar till late 19th century. In fact, till late 1890s. The only access to Srinagar was through River Jhelum. So every material would come or would be exported through River Jhelum. And obviously taxes had to be collected. So this is a taxation point on the river. So this is a riverfront house and people would be somewhere here, moving on the river. The access to the taxation house would be through this passage and people would pay taxes and move materials upwards or downwards. Now, this is the colonial influence on the Srinagar city. Essentially a residential house, you can see the impact of colonial style in various aspects, including windows, projections, everything. And on the northern end, which is this part, there's a hammam. Let me tell you, hammam is a place which is heated by burning wood underneath the floor of the room. The room is obviously made of stone and mud. Stone and mud. And these houses, looking very colonial, have local elements, as I mentioned here. This again is a riverfront building. Now, what this building is now known as a structure, a mere structure. But when it came up, in the late 19th, early 20th century, these are our shop houses and karkhanas. The houses on the riverfront, the ground floor would be a godown, then this would be a karkhana, this would be a showroom where things would be sold, and here people would live. So it was a complex structure of manufacture, of display, and accommodation, residential structure. You must have heard of wooden bridge of Srinagar or wooden bridge of Kashmir. So this is a typical wooden bridge which is made of the locally available timber that's known as deodar, and the structure has withstood floods, earthquakes, and this till very recently was the prevalent style or prevalent architecture for building for connecting two banks of the river or for building bridge across the river. Now this has changed. We have now concrete structures. Most of these houses also have these pendants as a decorative element, defining the decorative sense of the owner of the builders. And these elements hang like earrings on these houses. I have mentioned about this Pinjarakari or the lattice work. This is a variety of lattice work we have. These are wooden pieces joined together without any without any, they are joined automatically. They are not joined by nails, etc. And they become a full-fledged geometric design. This is one kind, is another kind, is another kind. There are about 16 geometric designs in Pinjarakari windows that have been found out here. This again is an extension of the jali used for partitions, used for windows, and for getting light inside the house. If you see this another essential feature of these vernacular houses of Srinagar, we call them dubs. They are projections. You know, Srinagar, we have two things in abundance here. One is light and one is fresh air. So what essentially this dub did was that these researchers did was that they expanded the space of a room for taking in both fresh air and light. This was done so aesthetically that it has by itself, independent of anything else, become an architectural feature. These are wooden jalis around Mirakaris. You will find them in old city all over. Now we are going to a shrine, as I mentioned, Shah Hamdan's shrine. You can see we have different types of ceilings here. There's a ceiling which is Khatamband ceiling. This is Khatamband painted ceiling. This is a pure Khatamband. We also have vaulted ceilings in certain shrines, and these are those ceilings. Now, we saw those vaulted ceilings, we saw the paper mache ceiling. You can see other decorative elements, which is paper mache ceilings. These are painted ceilings in various designs, and most of these designs you would see also in the shawls of Kashmir. You can see these wooden ceilings as also the paper mache. This is a typical Khatamband. Again, a timber ceiling, decorated timber ceiling, built around the geometric designs. Again, as I mentioned, more than 16 patterns. These vernacular houses also have on the top floor halls, which in local terminology is known as Diwan Khana. These are social spaces where people would meet for religious social gatherings. And these halls you can see are without support. But the main feature of the halls is that they are a larger space in the house and they have a lot of light and decoration around. As I mentioned while we were mapping the city, we also found houses which are as tall as 7 stories. Now, you can't imagine a 7 story structure without the support of steel and iron. These are houses made of on Tark system, which is a traditional technology of building houses, and they have stood earthquakes, they have stood all natural calamities and disasters. They're still standing there. Not many houses left, but this is a house which I wanted to show you. The architectural style of Srinagar also spread around the valley and across to areas of Jammu where there's a lot of Kashmiri population around. So these are pictures of similar structures in Bhadrawa, in Kishtwar, in Doda, in Jammu region, as also in Baramulla, which is another district. A typical, I have been using this term vernacular here. So vernacular house is a house built on traditional or local technologies. So there are two types of vernacular technologies in Kashmir. One is Daji Diwari, which is a wooden frame structure. The other is Tark system. The whole load is borne by a Tark, and this is a brick structure. Again, a Tark structure house. This is a house on a canal, not on the main river, but the system and the style remains the same. Another house for this is the head priest's house. You can see this projection here. How artisans and builders of Srinagar, of Kashmir, have addressed and answered all the needs of the people who use these houses. So, because he was a preacher, he had to show himself to the people. A dove was created here in a vernacular architect structure, so he would come and show the people his face or talk to people or whatever he wanted to do. Again, a colonial structure, which is subsequent to vernacular structure, but a lot of arch- vernacular impact on these structures. This is a typical colonial structure. This was a bag, it still is a bag made of wood with brick fills. A typical colonial structure which came up early 20th century. A colonial structure with a lot of local influences, essentially the same materials but mediated in different ways. A colonial structure, again a colonial structure. Earlier on, now this structure again is a vernacular structure. And in this vernacular structure, as I mentioned, there are a lot of social spaces which are known as Dewan Khana. This is a Dewan Khana, and you can see the use of timber by separating it from other rooms. We have talked about the structures, the vernacular architecture, but it's not that in the opening I had said that urbanization has taken its toll on the city. Now you can see the urbanization. That is what I perfectly precisely meant about. You have a house here, and on the left side, a new house is being constructed. The old house, the new house which is being constructed is in place of a house which was similar to the house on the right side. What you see how this house looked and what's coming up now. You can yourself make an assessment of how urban spaces are being tampered with. You can see a heritage or a vernacular house and how much of dirt and garbage is piling up. This is what I call vandalization. The same thing here, urban spaces being temple coming up, and we have seen beautiful temples which are still existing in Kashmir now. Cement and steel has taken over, and people now think a good structure would mean a structure which has a lot of cement and iron in it. Now, let me go to the conservation works. What I showed you so far is to give you a handle of the place and also the historicity of the place. Obviously, along with the history of Srinagar, we have structures which need to be restored now. Let me go to the one structure first. This structure is a very old 14th century mosque, which was abandoned because it had developed tremendous issues in terms of its usage, in terms of the structure, the, for 600 years. So this is a masjid known as Ali Masjid. It was built about 1471, and in 1935 the roof was changed. The mosque was in ruinous condition when we took it over sometime in 2005, and we started restoring it. People didn't believe there's something called restoration. Till that time, they always thought that you have to remove a structure so that you can do away with the damage which has occurred to the structure. But that's one first major structure where conservation principles were introduced in Kashmir. And that is how the structure was before it was conserved. That's how it looks now after it was conserved. Nothing has been removed, no walls have been removed, damages have been repaired, and damage were all over. These wooden pillars were also damaged, the stone base were also damaged. That's how it looks now. These are before and after pictures. This is how this mosque looked like. That's how it looks like now. This is a building which was built during the Dogra period, a colonial structure, a huge building. And I don't want to get into the details, but this building was demolished because somebody wanted purchased it and wanted to build a shopping complex. It's a riverside building, and obviously, as you know, we can't replicate them now for various reasons. So we did a huge civil campaign, and the building was when after this building was demolished. Now you see what it was, and now we see what happened. When this building was demolished, we stepped in, and as a law drawn civil complaint, the whole place was acquired. What you see here is the undemolished part. This was not demolished. They just left it there. Let me show you the slide where it is. This is the leftover part. When it was restored and reconstructed, see what a beauty the whole structure would have been. Now you can see how beautiful this space has become. We have a city museum has been set up there. This museum speaks about the arts and architecture of Srinagar city. We also built a floor above the demolished floor because we needed space. We couldn't do all the three stories, but this is what was done, and this space is now a museum or a interpretation center for crafts of Srinagar city. The copperware. We also have pashmina. Others looking at the objects here. Well, let's go to the main conservation work which was done in Srinagar on the Mughal garden. You know, these Mughal gardens are historic gardens, and over a period of time, for lack of maintenance, they had developed issues. Conservation works have been started. We took up six gardens of the which are surviving Mughal gardens, and the issues of conservation were about authenticity, were about urban and environmental issues. There were management issues which still are there, infrastructural facilities, visitor information. So a long-term plan was prepared and restoration of gardens were taken over. I'll take you quickly through some restoration work so that I give you an idea of what is happening to these structures. It's not that all structures are being restored. We are not touching even, it is the tip of an iceberg what I am showing you. Within the gardens or outside the gardens, but that is what has been done, which is this is a Baradari which was in Achabal garden. This is one of the perhaps the only Queen's garden we have in Kashmir built by Noor Jahan. This is what had happened to the structure. Now, the same Baradari has been restored, and that's how it looks now. The inside of the Baradari. This is the Baradari at Nishad Garden. It was almost, it was not only defunct, they had also surrendered it to the local locality and they did not put it to any use. But subsequently, with the support of the Department of Floriculture, a restoration work was taken up. That is how this Baradari looks like. These are the windows which were restored there. You see, in this Baradari, the water, as I said, the vandalization was such that water comes from outside for feeding the fountains and the central channel of the Mughal garden. This is kind of a place through which water used to come. This was replaced and a stone jali was put there that you can see. Paper mache ceiling was done and we didn't have any paper mache there because that paper mache had almost all vanished. So we picked up paper mache of ceilings of a next garden, which is Shalimar garden, and replicated those designs and they were put in place. These are some of the conservation. This is how it looked before conservation. That's how it looks. No stone has been changed. It has been cleaned and put in place. You can see on the left side, this is the pathway, and on the right side you can see after restoration, before and after. The walls have bulged and those stones are being replaced. This is how it looks now. We also have a Mughal Hammam in Shalimar. This was only in the historic references there was a Hammam. That is how it looked. A restoration work was taken up and that is how this Hammam looks like now. Oh my God. I've shown you the previous picture. You would have heard about this Dal Lake. That one of the structures in Dal Lake was in the lake itself. There was a bridge because they had done a causeway from one corner of the lake to the another corner. It was a walkway on which there were bridges for connecting the two, allowing passage between the two parts of the lake, and that is which was known as Untitled. This bridge had developed tremendous problems. It's almost at the verge of collapse. We got some assistance from the German embassy and who thought that this is an iconic bridge. In fact, fashion magazines were disfigured in 50s and 60s for models. And we took up restoration of the bridge. You see the damage that had taken place to the bridge. And when it was restored, that's how it looks now. Another restoration project for a college, which is again a colonial structure. It's known as Amar Singh College. A lot of work took place there. I'll show you the last restoration work. There's a temple somewhere in Manasbal on the banks of a very crystal clear lake. This temple is what you see was in 2009. The temple was located at on the bank of the lake, on the shores of the lake, and government had at some point in time tried to protect it by putting a fencing, which again was broken. Temple remained where it was. Subsequently, government intervened and they thought that they should have a proper fencing for the temple, and they did a proper plinth on which they did a fencing, and they thought that we thought that the temple has been secure. But while a project was done for beautification of Manasbar Lake, we did some research, and obviously it didn't gel well with what we thought about the spring temple. The temple would always be in the middle of the spring, as in other parts of Kashmir. So we tried to clean it a bit, and we found that this temple is a monolith, a single stone temple with a hollow space inside on the ground, on the lower portion. But it has been located wrongly. So we did a lot of cleaning. I don't want to go through the conservation process, but when the whole project, conservation or restoration project was completed, that is what the temple was. The temple was essentially in the middle. The water body or the sibling was polluted that we couldn't see any water emerging out of it. What has happened now is not only that the temple has been restored to its respectable location in the spring. This spring has also become a big resource for the lake because the spring gets fresh water to the lake. These are some conservation works which I wanted to show you. Now, let me tell you all that I have spoken here in this presentation is not only the history of Srinagar city, it also talks about the deviations, the vandalism. It also gives rise to an urgent need that whatever can be restored should be restored. And we still have structures here which become part of our living history. We can read history out of these structures, out of gardens, out of temples, out of mosques. All we need is some sensitivity, some focus on the historicity and authenticity of these places, be those secular, sacred, whatever. Kashmir has always been a habitation of composite culture, and that compositeness can be revived to a very large extent through the medium of architecture, through the medium of these structures or icons of the past. Thank you for being part of this presentation. I hope we would have, to a large extent, given you a handle of how Srinagar looks or how Srinagar would have looked before it was urbanized to an extent to which it's urbanized now. Thanks once again, both to IIC and the viewers. Thank you.